At 69 years old, I believed I had entered a season of life where drama belonged to younger people and heartbreak had already taught me all its lessons. But life rarely respects our timelines. My name is Carolyn Mitchell, and this is the story of how my world quietly fractured before rebuilding itself into something I never expected. One calm spring morning in Asheville, as the mountains behind my home glowed soft green and the sun warmed the edge of my coffee cup, I realized something unsettling. My husband Thomas hadn't truly looked at me in months. Not the distracted "love you" he tossed out while reaching for his car keys, but the kind of look that rests on your face with affection and intention. I tried to brush it off at first, telling myself that after 27 years of marriage, routine simply replaces romance. But a woman my age knows when something is wrong. Little signs began creeping into my days, quietly stacking themselves like unanswered mail. Late nights he couldn't explain, business trips that had never existed before, text messages he shielded with his body, the sudden importance of meetings he never mentioned previously. My daughter Jennifer insisted I was overthinking things, that I was just feeling lonely or anxious, but a woman doesn't reach nearly 70 years of life without earning a sharp instinct, one that whispers the truth she doesn't want to face. Eventually that whisper grew too loud to ignore, so on a foggy Tuesday morning, with trembling hands and a pounding heart, I opened the yellow pages, yes, the actual yellow pages, and searched for a private investigator. The small, upstairs office I walked into looked nothing like the movies. Frank Delgado wasn't a shadowy figure lurking behind blinds. He was simply a tired, middle-aged man with kind eyes, a man who looked like he remembered everyone's birthday but always lost his car keys. Somehow his gentleness made it possible for me to speak. I told him everything. The late returns home, the hidden phone, the strange restaurant receipts, the hollow feeling growing inside me. When I finished, Frank leaned back and said something that struck me like a cold wind. 70% of the time when someone comes in here with your instincts, they turn out to be right. The real question is, are you ready for the truth? My throat tightened, but I nodded. I paid the retainer, even though every part of me wished the truth would simply vanish. 4 days later, Frank called. Not to report over the phone, but to ask me to come in person. His voice alone told me everything was about to change. When I entered his office, photographs were spread across his desk like broken pieces of a life I thought I understood. Thomas's car outside restaurants I'd never heard of. Thomas walking beside a woman with blonde hair and elegant clothes. Thomas holding her hand the way he once held mine. Her name is Patricia Chambers, Frank said quietly. Real estate agent. Local. I felt my knees weaken, but before I could process the betrayal, Frank slid another file toward me. There's something else you need to know. He hesitated, then added. She doesn't only go by Patricia Chambers. Her legal last name is Patricia Mitchell. My husband's last name. The room seemed to close in. The air thickened. My pulse roared in my ears. What are you saying? I whispered. Frank exhaled slowly, his eyes full of apology. There's a chance this isn't just an affair, Carolyn. There's a chance she's something else entirely. And in that moment, the ground under my life shifted forever. The drive home after Frank's revelation felt unreal, as if the familiar roads had twisted into something foreign, each tree and streetlight watching me with quiet sympathy. How could Thomas, a man I had loved for nearly 3 decades, be living a life so enormous, so deceitful, right under my nose? The name Patricia Mitchell echoed in my mind like a storm. The thought that she might not just be a mistress but somehow tied to my husband legally, or emotionally in ways deeper than an affair, sent waves of nausea through me. When I reached home, I sat in the driveway for nearly 20 minutes, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened, afraid that stepping inside would make everything real. The house, once warm and alive, now felt like a museum of lies. His slippers by the fireplace, his coat hanging by the door, his favorite mug on the counter. Every object suddenly told a story I no longer understood. I spent the night sifting through old photo albums, stacking them in uncertain piles, trying to pinpoint the moment our marriage began to drift toward this quiet catastrophe. Thomas came home around 11 p.m., smelling faintly of cologne I didn't recognize, humming the way he did when he thought he looked particularly handsome. He kissed my cheek absent-mindedly, unaware that only hours earlier I had seen photographs of him kissing someone else. Long day, he sighed, stretching. I've got to be up early, big meeting tomorrow. And then he disappeared into the shower. I watched him move around the room with the ease of a man who believed his secrets were perfectly hidden. A strange calm settled over me. Not peace but clarity. I knew I needed more information, not just about the woman but about the meaning behind her last name. So the next morning, without telling anyone, I drove to the county courthouse. The clerk, a polite young woman with nervous glasses, typed Patricia Chambers Mitchell into her computer. The moment she pressed enter, her eyebrows jumped slightly. A tiny involuntary reaction that told me she had stumbled upon something interesting. "Ma'am," she said gently, turning the screen slightly away from me. "This is unusual." She paused. "There are sealed records tied to this name. And sealed records usually involve guardianship, adoption, or cases where the court is protecting someone's identity." My breath caught. Adoption? Guardianship? Identity protection? Why would a grown woman connected to my husband have sealed legal documents under his last name? I walked out of the courthouse with paperwork I didn't fully understand and a heart that felt heavier than my chest could hold. That night, while Thomas slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, realizing that this wasn't just infidelity. This wasn't just betrayal. This was a secret big enough to destroy everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my husband, and perhaps even my own past. And somehow, instinctively, I knew the truth was far darker than an affair. It felt like a secret that had been waiting decades for me to uncover. For the next 2 days, I moved through my home like a ghost, performing all my usual routines. Watering the plants, preparing meals, answering Jennifer's calls. Yet inside I was unraveling thread by thread. Every time Thomas walked past me, every time he casually mentioned work or checked his phone with that sudden anxious flicker in his eyes, another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. But the more pieces I gathered, the less the picture resembled anything I recognized. I needed clarity, something undeniable, something I could confront him with, not out of rage but out of survival. So on Friday afternoon, I met Frank again, this time in the back booth of a quiet diner where the lights were dim and no one would pay attention to two older people talking in low voices. He handed me a folder, thicker than before, and took a slow breath as if preparing me for impact. Inside were more photographs. Thomas entering a modest suburban house, Thomas hugging the blonde woman with gentle familiarity, Thomas carrying grocery bags into what looked like a family home rather than a lover's hideout. But what made my chest tighten was the next photo. Thomas sitting on a worn-out couch, laughing with a young man who looked no older than 20. The resemblance between the boy and my husband was unmistakable. The same jawline, the same tilt of the eyebrows, even the same crooked half-smile. My fingers trembled around the edge of the picture. "Who is he?" I whispered, already fearing the answer. Frank slid a page toward me. "His name is River Chambers. Born 21 years ago. Legally changed his last name at age 11 to Mitchell." The room swayed. My ears rang. My heart beat so loudly it felt like the walls were shaking with it. A part of me wanted to deny it, to reject the possibility entirely, but denial has a short shelf life when the truth is staring back at you in full color. "Is he?" I couldn't finish the question. Frank nodded grimly. "All my indicators say yes. And if that's the case, it means your husband has been financially supporting them for years, silently, off the books, through sealed records and private accounts. It also means the woman, Patricia, could very well be more than just an affair. She might be someone he's been tied to since before you married him." I felt my throat close. Before I could speak, Frank reached into the folder one last time and handed me a single yellow document, something that looked older than the rest. When I unfolded it, my breath caught. At the top was a name, Patricia Mayer, not Chambers, and below it, in faded ink, "Guardianship transfer filed 1996. Applicant, Thomas Aaron Mitchell." My vision blurred as I tried to make sense of it. Guardianship? Transfer? 1996? That was the year Thomas and I had been planning our second honeymoon. The same year he told me work was too hectic for travel. The same year he started having those unexplained overnight trips. The truth hit me all at once and tore through my chest like a blade. Thomas hadn't simply cheated. He had built an entire hidden family long before I ever suspected. And I, oblivious and trusting, had been living beside a stranger for nearly 3 decades. Carolyn, Frank said in a gentle voice, this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This is a double life. My tears didn't fall yet. They stayed suspended in my eyes, heavy and burning, refusing to give me the relief of release. Because what do you do when your entire marriage collapses in a single afternoon? You don't cry. You don't scream. You simply sit there, holding the truth like a ticking bomb, and wonder how much of your life was ever really yours. The drive home that evening felt like traveling through a world that no longer belonged to me. Every memory I passed, the bakery where Thomas and I used to get cinnamon rolls on Sundays, the park where we'd taken Jennifer for picnics, the cafe where he once surprised me with flowers, had turned sour, as if the truth had seeped backward through time, poisoning everything it touched. I parked the car and sat motionless, the folder of documents heavy in my lap like a box of buried sins finally exhumed. I wanted to storm inside and scream. Who is Patricia? Who is River? What life have you built behind my back? But that impulse dissolved when I remembered Frank's final warning. Don't confront him until you know exactly what you want out of this. Information without a plan is just pain. So instead I walked inside quietly, like an actress returning to a role she no longer believed in. Thomas was in his recliner, watching a documentary, humming to himself, his glasses slipping down his nose the way they always did. He looked ordinary, comfortable, unworried. It was the familiarity of his posture that hurt the most, how easily he lived in a home full of lies. You're home late, he said without looking away from the screen. Traffic, I replied, though we both knew I rarely blamed traffic for anything. He glanced at me curiously but didn't press. That was the thing about Thomas. He only asked questions when the answers benefited him. Later that night, when he fell asleep beside me, his breathing heavy and even, I quietly slipped into his office to examine the life he'd hidden. I knew the password to his computer. He hadn't changed it in years. Another sign of how deeply he underestimated me. The glow of the screen illuminated the truth he never intended me to see. Emails with Patricia, long emotional exchanges discussing finances, medical bills, River's college plans, even holiday gifts. He wasn't just supporting them. He was intimately involved in their lives. There were wire transfers labeled house repairs, tuition, emergency fund. And then I found it. An email from Patricia dated 6 months ago. You promised we wouldn't live in the shadows forever. River deserves to know why you chose Carolyn over us. When will you tell her? When will you stop hiding? My hand shook so violently I had to steady myself against the desk. It wasn't just adultery. It was a shared life. Parallel universe. A version of family he chose but kept tucked away like a shameful secret. And then came the worst part. Another email from Thomas, short and cold. Not yet. She wouldn't survive the truth. For a moment, everything inside me froze. Survive? He thought I was too weak, too fragile, too foolish to handle the truth of the man I married. He kept a second family because he believed my heart wasn't strong enough to bear the fracture he caused. I closed the computer and sat in the dark, my breath trembling in my chest. The room spun, the walls closed in, and a crushing silence wrapped around me like a shroud. This wasn't just betrayal. This wasn't just secrets. This was the cruelest kind of dismissal, a belief that my age, my softness, my trust made me incapable of surviving the truth. But he was wrong. Because at that moment something inside me hardened, crystallized, sharpened. I was done being the quiet, predictable wife who folded laundry and paid bills and accepted whatever crumbs of attention he offered. Thomas thought I wouldn't survive the truth. He had no idea that the truth was about to become the very thing that set me free. The next morning I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years, sharp, cold, and strangely empowering. The kind of clarity that arrives only after your world has been shattered and rearranged before your eyes. I moved through the house quietly, observing everything with a new gaze. As if I were a visitor walking through a museum of the life I'd once believed in. The photographs on the wall, vacations, anniversaries, birthdays, felt like staged scenes rather than memories. The wedding portrait above the fireplace, once a symbol of devotion, now looked like evidence of a long-running lie. I made Thomas breakfast the way I always did: eggs over easy, toast lightly browned, coffee with 1 teaspoon of sugar. He sat across from me reading the newspaper, completely unaware that I knew he had been feeding 2 families while starving our marriage. He didn't notice the way I watched him, studying every gesture, every blink, every practiced expression. "You're quiet," he finally said, not lowering the newspaper. "Just tired," I replied, though exhaustion wasn't anywhere near the storm that churned inside me. After he left for work, I called Jennifer and told her I'd be visiting her later in the week. I didn't mention anything about Thomas or the hidden life I had uncovered. Instead, I spent the day gathering documents, financial records, property deeds, insurance policies, sorting through years of paperwork Thomas had assumed I never looked at. The more I read, the clearer the pattern became. Private withdrawals, off-the-books payments, investment accounts I'd never heard of, all discreetly funneled into a life he'd kept locked away. Around noon I called Frank. I needed more than confirmation. I needed the full truth, all of it, no matter how devastating. We met again at the diner, the same booth where he had first told me that Thomas's betrayal wasn't just an affair but a double life. This time he slid a thicker envelope toward me. "Carolyn," he said softly, "I found the connection." My pulse quickened as I opened the file. Inside were 2 birth certificates, River's and one belonging to a girl named Lila, a 19-year-old college student. "Another child?" I whispered, the words barely audible. Frank nodded. "Both legally changed their last names to Mitchell as minors. Both supported by your husband. Both included in sealed court documents." I felt the blood drain from my face. 2 children. Not 1. 2 lives Thomas had quietly shaped while pretending to be the devoted husband and father in our home. But the most horrifying part wasn't the number of children, it was the timeline. Lila was born in 2005. Thomas and I were celebrating our 14th wedding anniversary that year. I remembered the candlelit dinner, the necklace he surprised me with, the smile he wore as if he were the luckiest man alive. Meanwhile, he had a newborn child with another woman. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I reached for the next document. It was a medical report: Patricia's stage 3 breast cancer. "She's sick," I said, my voice breaking unexpectedly. "Yes," Frank said gently. "And according to this, Thomas has been covering all her treatments." My mind swirled as emotions twisted inside me. Anger, betrayal, shock, and unexpectedly grief. Grief not for Thomas, but for the innocent people pulled into the web of his secrecy. For the children who had grown up in shadows. For the woman who had chosen survival over morality. For myself, who had unknowingly been a ghost in my own marriage. When I stepped outside, the world looked different: harsher, louder, more real. A gust of wind blew through the parking lot, scattering dried leaves across the pavement, and for the first time in my life, I understood what it felt like for a life to break open. Not in a moment of explosive anger, but in a quiet, devastating unfolding. As I sat in my car gripping the steering wheel, one realization settled deep within me. This story wasn't just about betrayal. It was about identity, mine, Thomas's, and the families built out of secrets. And I knew then that the woman who walked into the diner that afternoon wasn't the same woman who walked out. Something in me had awakened, and there was no going back. Driving home from the diner felt like floating through a world made of glass. Everything fragile, everything sharp, everything one wrong breath away from shattering completely. I kept seeing the names in my mind: River, Lila. Seeing their ages, their faces, their timelines folding perfectly into the years Thomas and I had been building what I thought was a loyal marriage. The betrayal wasn't a single wound. It was a lifetime of small cuts I hadn't felt until they all bled at once. When I walked into the house, sunlight was spilling through the living room window in soft golden streams, dust floating through the air like tiny quiet truths that had always been there, waiting to be seen. I stood in that warm light wondering how many evenings I had spent here, waiting for a man who was busy visiting another family, comforting a sick woman, watching his children's school recitals, paying bills for a life I wasn't even allowed to know existed. I moved slowly through the house, touching the back of the sofa where Thomas used to lean during football games, brushing my hand against the counter where I used to set dinner, feeling every corner of this home differently now. Like the set of a play I'd been performing in without knowing the script was fake. When Thomas came home that evening, his expression startled me. He looked exhausted, tense, irritated in a way I hadn't seen before. He tossed his keys onto the table and rubbed his temples. "Rough day," he muttered. I wanted so desperately to ask him if the roughness came from his office or from the other family whose world was falling apart under the weight of cancer and secrets and stolen years. But instead I simply said, "Oh." He didn't answer. He just sat heavily in his chair. And then something unexpected happened. He looked at me, really looked at me as if searching for something. "You're different lately," he said quietly. "Something's changed." For a moment fear rippled through me. Had he noticed my investigation? My distance? My silence? But then I realized something else. Thomas wasn't suspicious. He was insecure. For the first time in our marriage, he wasn't in control. "Just tired," I said calmly, the same lie I had used the day before. He nodded, but the unease didn't leave his eyes. Over the next few days I watched him change. He left earlier, came home later, texted more secretly, took more phone calls in the garage, paced more often. It was clear the pressure of his double life was collapsing on him. Not because he felt guilty, but because he was afraid the walls were closing in. Meanwhile, I became a quiet observer. I spent my days gathering knowledge, checking bank accounts, photocopying documents, reading legal papers, meeting Frank, even secretly recording conversations. Each new detail was like a thread, and I wove them together not out of revenge but out of preparation. I knew a confrontation was coming. I didn't know when or how or what price it would demand from me, but I could feel it approaching like a storm you hear before you see the lightning. And then one evening, something happened that told me the storm had finally reached my doorstep. Thomas walked in the front door, pale and trembling, clutching a folded document in his hand. "Carolyn," he said, his voice shaking, "we need to talk." My heart thudded, slow and heavy. He placed the paper on the table between us. "It's about Patricia," he whispered. "Something's happened." And in that moment I understood. This wasn't just the beginning of the end. This was the beginning of the truth. Thomas stood in front of me clutching that folded document like it was the only thing keeping him upright. His face drained of all color, a tremor running through his hands that I had never seen before. For a moment we simply stared at each other. Two people living in the same house yet standing on opposite sides of an invisible cliff. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. "Patricia, she collapsed this morning. The doctors say it's bad. They don't think she has much time." The words hit me with a confusing force, pain, shock, and a strange kind of sorrow that was not for him but for a woman I had never met, who had been tangled in my life long before I ever knew her name. I didn't respond. I just watched him, noticing the way his eyes glistened with a grief he had never once shown for me in all our years together. For Patricia, his face broke open. For me, he had always worn a mask. "I need to go to the hospital," he continued, his voice trembling with urgency. "There are things I have to handle." I wanted to ask, "Handle? Like a family you've been hiding? A life you built behind my back? 2 children you raised in shadows while I cooked your dinners and folded your shirts?" But the words stayed locked inside me. Instead, I quietly said, "Then go." He blinked, surprised by how calmly I said it. But what he didn't understand was that calm isn't the absence of pain. It's the moment you stop begging someone to love you the way you deserve. He grabbed his coat and rushed out, slamming the door with a force that shook the frame. When the sound faded, an aching silence filled the room. A silence that felt less like abandonment and more like space. Space for the truth to finally breathe. I sat at the dining table, the same place where I had once placed birthday cakes, holiday turkeys, handwritten cards from Jennifer, and where Thomas had once kissed my cheek and thanked me for another beautiful dinner. Now there was nothing beautiful left. Only the truth laid bare like the document spread across the table. As I waited for him to return, I imagined Patricia in a hospital bed, weak and fading, her children River and Lila, standing beside her, unaware that the life they had been living was built on secrets and half-truths. I imagined Thomas rushing through those hospital doors, not as a husband hiding an affair, but as a man terrified of losing the last piece of a life he never revealed. Hours passed before he finally returned. This time he didn't slam the door. He walked in quietly, shoulders slumped, eyes red. He looked older, years older, like the weight of his choices had finally landed on him with full force. Without looking at me, he set his keys down and whispered, "She wants to see you." I felt the ground shift beneath me. "Me," I said, barely able to form the word. Thomas nodded. "She asked for you by name." A strange chill rippled down my spine. How did she know me? Why would she want to see me? And what truth had Thomas kept buried so deeply that even now, when everything was falling apart, he still couldn't say it out loud? With a hesitant breath, I stood up, realizing that whatever waited for me in that hospital room would change everything. Not just my marriage, but the story of my entire life. The drive to the hospital felt like moving through the final chapter of a book I never meant to read. Each mile carrying the weight of secrets that had been gathering dust in the corners of my marriage for nearly 3 decades. When I walked through the sliding glass doors, the sterile scent of antiseptic wrapped around me, and for the first time since learning the truth, I felt my heartbeat slow, as if my body already understood that whatever lay ahead would either break me entirely or set me free. Thomas led me down a quiet hallway, his steps unsteady, his shoulders hunched in a way I had never seen before. When we reached Patricia's room, he stopped, hesitated, and whispered, "Please be kind." The request stung, not because he asked it, but because he never once asked the same kindness for me in all the years he deceived me. He pushed the door open, and there she was, Patricia, thin, pale, her hair barely grazing her shoulders, her breathing shallow but steady. Yet when her eyes met mine, they were piercingly clear, filled not with fear or hostility, but with something I couldn't name. She motioned me closer, and Thomas stepped back as if he no longer had the right to stand between us. "Carolyn," she said softly, her voice like brittle paper. "Thank you for coming." I swallowed hard, unsure what words belonged in a moment like this. She reached weakly toward the bedside table where a small folder Saturday. "There's something I need you to know before I'm gone." I glanced at Thomas, but he couldn't meet my eyes. With trembling fingers, Patricia opened the folder and handed me a faded photograph. In it, 2 young women stood side by side, one unmistakably her, the other me, except younger, freer, smiling at a world still full of promise. My breath caught. My knees nearly buckled. "You remember the summer you volunteered at the Children's Center?" Patricia asked gently. "The year your younger sister, Elena, left for California?" My mind reeled. Elena. The name cracked open a sealed part of my memory. My sister who vanished from our lives, sending only sporadic postcards before disappearing completely. "She wasn't in California," Patricia whispered. "She came to us. To me. I was her caseworker." My pulse roared in my ears. "Caseworker?" Patricia nodded. "Your sister was pregnant, Carolyn. She was terrified. Alone. She didn't want your parents to know. She didn't want the child to grow up tangled in the family she ran from." A wave of nausea rolled over me as the pieces of the puzzle shifted into an entirely new picture. "River," I whispered. "Lila." Patricia closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Your sister's children. Elena died during Lila's birth. I took them in. I raised them as my own. And Thomas." Her voice cracked. "Thomas stepped in when I had no one else. Not out of love for me, but out of responsibility for you. He never told you because your sister begged him not to. She didn't want her children to carry the shame she felt. She wanted them to have a new life, a peaceful one." I staggered back, overwhelmed, breathless, dizzy with the crushing realization that the betrayal I thought Thomas committed was so much more complicated, so twisted in love, loyalty, secrecy, and pain. But then Patricia added in a trembling whisper, "He should have told you. You deserved the truth. You deserved more than half a life." I couldn't speak. I couldn't think. I could only stand there as years of confusion, anger, and heartbreak rearranged themselves into something unrecognizable. Not forgiveness, not clarity, but understanding, raw and devastating. Patricia's breathing grew faint. She squeezed my hand gently, Please be kinder to him than life has been. And then with a slow exhale, she slipped into stillness, leaving behind the truth that had been buried for nearly 20 years. When Thomas walked me out of the room, he finally looked at me, not with charm or excuses or practiced lies, but with the hollow eyes of a man who had carried a secret heavy enough to break him. "I'm sorry," he whispered, voice shaking. "I tried to protect you. I tried to honor her. But in the process I destroyed us." I didn't answer. Not because I had nothing to say, but because some truths are too large for words. As we stepped into the fading light outside the hospital, I realized something profound. My life was not ending here. It was beginning again. And this time it would begin with the truth.